I'm Kirsty. I'm the Director of New Contemporaries, and thank you all very much for coming back today for the Shape of Things to Come, the second day of our 70th anniversary conference, with this session borrowing its title from an early Glen Brown painting which was included in the 1989 New Contemporaries exhibition. For those of you who are joining us for today, I'm delighted to be welcoming you to the Courtauld Institute of Art for the celebration of New Contemporaries. This conference has been very generously supported by Art Fund and the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, and we're most appreciative for this assistance, without which this element of our 70th anniversary celebratory programme would not have been possible. We're also really delighted that two of our trustees will be sponsoring this evening's drinks through their soft drinks company, Peter Spanton. So be warned, there will be delicious cocktails on offer. I'd like to extend our thanks once again to the Courtauld Research Forum for their enthusiasm in working with us on this important moment, especially Alex Bovey, Leila Bimbra, Grace Williams, Anna Finoldi, and the other students' helpers who have been with us over the past 2 days. The New Contemporaries team of Seamus McCormack, Sophie Bones and Laura Plant continue to work tirelessly to make this and the rest of our 70th anniversary programme happen, while our PhD candidate Emily Gray has been vital in our research for the conference, and of course our board has helped us shape this event, especially Sasha Craddock and George Vasey, with Sasha and Emily making such brilliant contributions to yesterday's conversations. We are also hugely thankful to the incredible group of 35 contributors across the 2 days, 18 of whom are participating today. The commitment of our speakers' time and energy has helped us make this conference such a success. Yesterday's discussions were truly dynamic and engaging and ranged across class, identity, gender politics, and the agency of performative practices. Our contributors across both days have been drawn for our impressive list of artists that have been part of New Contemporaries either as exhibitors or selectors since 1949. Today, we are looking at our more recent history and extending out to our extensive network of partners and friends of New Contemporaries, as well as the Courtauld's own incredible list of alumni. To give you a quick overview of our history, New Contemporaries started life as Young Contemporaries. Emerging into a post-World War II Britain in 1949, as we touched on yesterday, our founding principles sprang from the optimism of the time, chiming with the utopian aspirations that were key in reimagining what Britain could look like socially, politically, economically and culturally in the future. Central to this was the belief that the future strength of the country lay in giving people from a broad range of demographic backgrounds access to free education. For New Contemporaries, this is bound up in the contribution that creativity can play in this process of rebuilding and reimagining, with the assertion that the voices and work of emerging artists deserve to find a place within a national network of exhibition spaces. This is a basis on which we have continued to operate while remaining responsive to an ever-evolving and rapidly changing art world, which is now completely unrecognisable from that of 1949. The core of our work still revolves around our open submission annual touring exhibition for emerging artists, which has undergone a range of transformations since 1949. Originally showing all of the submitted work in London and extensively touring a smaller curated exhibition across the UK and other social spaces such as libraries and institutes. By the 1960s, and again reflecting the spirit of the time, the organising structure of New Contemporaries became increasingly student-led, while 1974 saw the name change from Young to New Contemporaries in recognition that not all of the selected artists fitted a certain age profile. More recently, and vital to continuing to ensure open access to our work, in 2018, the annual call for submissions was opened up to artists from non-degree awarding programs in recognition of the financial challenges and resulting access issues that artists face when following the formalised route of degree awarding education to develop their practice. It's also worth noting here that selection is done blind for New Contemporaries, so Our selectors don't have access to artist names, their genders, place of study, etc. As we touched on yesterday, we've consistently given visibility to practice as they're coming into being, with New Contemporaries being associated with presenting new approaches to making as they emerge from UK arts education, whether this is through moving image, performative practices, or digital technologies and platforms, which we'll be unpacking a little bit today. We are unique in our focus on nurturing and making emerging artistic practice visible, as well as engaging with the ever-changing landscape of galleries and the role of art school education over the past 70 years. Operating without a formalised structure until comparatively recently, unsurprisingly, ours is a history with breaks and disruptions, as well as new starts and directions. The most recent of these took place in 1988, when the organisation relaunched following an Arts Council feasibility study written by Richard Stokes, which highlighted New Contemporaries' important place as a site for innovation and discussion, as well as a presentation of new work. This assertion that New Contemporaries is not just a site for showcasing work is critical here, and one that we've continued to work with and build on. Our shifting nature and dispersed archive, we only hold material from the point of relaunch in 1988 on, with the rest of the material held as part of the Arts Council archive at the National Art Library at V&A, at Tate as part of the ICA's collection, and in numerous and as yet unexplored private collections, means that any attempt to gain an overview of New Contemporary story can therefore only ever be a partial history. There are, however, some recurring themes in terms of debates around expanded forms of practice, their inclusion in our exhibition, and the ways to best support emerging artists in an ever-evolving sector that have recurred over our 70-year history. Yesterday, In My Generation, a title also borrowed from the 1989 show, we scratched the surface of our incredible, rich and complex history, revisiting some of the moments pre-1988 with our contributors. Today we will look at our more recent history in an attempt to map out through a series of panels, presentations and performances the future direction and needs of emerging artists and practices. Our panels will focus on the potentials offered to artists by online platforms and virtual spaces, the possibilities and pitfalls inherent in working collaboratively, the support structures needed to sustain emerging practice, and the role of artist curators in rethinking forms of exhibition making. Before we start, I just want to run through some housekeeping. Please make sure that you've got your phones on silent. If you're using social media today, please can we ask you to include the hashtags hashtag NC70 and the handle at New Contemps, which is up there. These are also on your programs. We're recording the event today and also taking photographs. Both of these will form an important part of our archive, which we're consistently adding to, and we're particularly interested in hearing from new and young contemporaries, particularly if they have stories or materials that they'd like to share with us, especially from that pre-1988 period. If the fire alarm goes off, there's 2 fire exits out of this room, 2 fire exits after that. The muster point is downstairs in the yard, and there's fire marshals to guide you. We've got a very full programme for the day, but we'll be taking breaks in the morning, at lunchtime, and in the afternoon. There's a place on the floor above to get drinks. I'm not sure about food today. Can't vouch for that. There's a loo on this floor and loos on the other floors, but I think you'll have to move through the building via the lifts today, because I think you need a key card to get through to the staircase. We'll be finishing up the day with a performance by Patrick Cole, who was included in the 2013 exhibition, and I hope that all of you will stay for that and for the aforementioned delicious drinks. It's now with great pleasure that I introduce our first panel, which is chaired by Erika Balsom, Senior Lecturer in Film Studies at King's College London, whose research and work is located at the intersection of art and cinema. Erika is joined in this panel by artist Lawrence Lek, who is known for his work that operates in the field of virtual reality and simulation. Quel faux pas. Laura Sillars is director of NEMA and Courtauld Alumni, who, amongst other projects, has curated Liquid Crystal Display, which looks at the use of crystals in digital technologies and artist work. A New Contemporaries alumni from 1994, John Thompson, who is Professor of Fine Art at the Slade, who also works collaboratively with Alison Craighead, who was also joining this panel, as well as the next panel with John. And Alison is reader in contemporary art at the University of Westminster and also lectures at Goldsmiths. So I hand over to our first panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. So this panel is called The Evolving Gallery, Online Platforms and Virtual Spaces. So there's a sense in which we're talking about something absolutely of the now and perhaps looking into the future a little bit. But I thought I would start by going back to 1933 with an internal report that was produced at the BBC. And in this report, someone called E. Robb wrote, "The transmission of art exhibitions by television is the beginning of an era when the public will be taught to appreciate great works of art, seeing them in their homes." And so sometimes I think there's an assumption that all of the questions that we'll be talking about today about the electronic delivery of artworks is actually a recent thing, but in fact, especially within the history of artist film and video, there's a much longer tradition of circulating art in this way that really goes back to the fulfillment of this desire from the 33 BBC report that happens in the 60s with the circulation of video being broadcast on television. I thought I would start by bringing this up just to maybe dislodge us a little bit from thinking that the questions that we're facing today are absolutely new. I think we have lots of ways that we can return to these earlier moments to think maybe about some tools for looking at our contemporary situation. So today I think each of the panelists is going to talk for about 10 minutes about their own work and experiences with circulating artworks in this way. I'll just mention a couple possible precedents that we could think of for this kind of work. We could go back to Aldo Tambellini and Otto Piane's Blackgate Cologne from 1968, which is often referred to as the first artist-made videotape that was broadcast on public television. And so this was a happening that was staged in the studios of the Westdeutscher Rundfunk and then remixed with additional material for broadcast. We have a whole host of experiments through the late 60s on primarily European public television and some in the US as well. In this country, I think a very important moment to look to in this regard is the early 80s, when we have Channel 4 created in 1982 with a mandate of experimentation, innovation, and creativity, commissioning many artists to make work for television and also exhibiting a lot of work that had been initially shown in a theatrical context on television. So we could think of anthology programs like The 11th Hour, which ran from 82 to 88, and also Midnight Underground, which ran in 1993 and 97. And as you can tell from the titles of these programs, they were broadcast extremely late at night in perhaps undesirable time slots. Rod Stoneman, who produced them so that they were shown in the tundra of the schedule. And yet they reached really quite massive audiences. Artists were paid actually quite well to show their work on Midnight Underground and on the 11th Hour. Yet at the same time we have works that were maybe shown for gallery presentation or made for cinema presentation on the small screen between commercials and things like that. So I think looking back at this really brings us to think about some of the questions around the online circulation of work today, which have to do at once with issues of financial support. So the monetization of online distribution, I think, is a big question, but also questions of authorial control, of medium specificity, of the sort of specific contexts of display that some works may benefit from that are perhaps lost when shown online. We also have the question, I think, of a kind of question of fit between what a work is doing at the level of content and how it then might be distributed. So are there certain kinds of works that we could think of that are perhaps especially well-suited or perhaps should necessarily be shown online, or are there other contexts in which that would potentially be some sort of secondary, degraded context of presentation? I'll leave it there for now, but I think Alison and John, you're going to begin.
Good morning, thank you for coming, and thanks for that introduction. We are going to spend 10 minutes talking, we're going to give a couple of examples of works that we've made, slightly older works actually, that we made around about 10 years ago, that perhaps engage with this topic at some level. When we first left art school in the early 90s, it was the dawning of the web. So the World Wide Web was just really coming into consciousness, and just the uptake of it happened during the 90s, really, for the most part.
So I think 94, 95, we couldn't afford a studio. And so we did have access to the internet. So we started to make work and show work on the internet at those kind of early times and do some sketches.
Yeah, and we actually applied to the Prince's Trust, of all places, to get a computer, which then allowed us to use it almost as a studio, except it just sat in our bedroom. So we made works like this one, which exist online, and use the web as a kind of, the internet as a kind of site for the work. This is just a simple visualization of the world through live weather information that becomes, through its multiplication, a kind of hypnotic animation. And we also, towards the end of the 90s,
we were really interested in the dot-com bubble as it was bursting. Right, it became really, we were very lucky to be able to kind of explore and work in the area at this point. And so we wanted to then make our own dot-com adventure. So we decided to make tea towels to commemorate the web as we saw it, as our main seller.
And the website itself functioned as an e-commerce shop, but we were, I guess, asking the question at that time, can we, through the selling of a series of products that were, to a large extent, satirical, of museum gift shops and things like that, as a kind of e-commerce venture, is that a place where work can exist? However, that was in the 90s, and the web has changed. It's gone through two ructions, really. It had the dot-com bubble and its collapse at the turn of the millennium. And then, of course, there's been a steady sort of shift towards a kind of walled, gardened model with apps and spaces which are corporate entities, effectively.
And the bringing in of social media.
Yeah, which becomes a kind of place where you can circulate work, but it is rather subject to its own institutional environment, which you can say about galleries as well. But it's just something which has happened. It's been dramatic. So that utopian space in the early 90s quickly gave way to various attempts and then successful attempts to monetize it.
So I guess we were kind of early adopters of the web as a place to show, make, have this compressed, amazing space where you'd make it, show it, had control, and then our ideas started to change quite rapidly. And I guess we're now looking at work where maybe we start to try and look at our behaviour online.
And also, as well as our behaviour online, we started becoming more interested, less as the web as a site, but more as a kind of material space, a space where we can use its materiality in some way to kind of make artworks. So we're going to talk about two artworks now. This first one, Beacon, is a work that we made in 2005. and it exists in different forms, but the main form we're going to talk about today is it as a railway flap sign. And what it takes, this is our very technical diagram about what happens, is searches being made on the web are kind of intercepted at random by us, by a little piece of software we made, and then displayed randomly in series on the sign. So on the railway flap sign, every 60 seconds a new search term randomly selected just appears.
So we were really interested in trying to hold up a mirror to show us what we were looking for and who we were and what we were doing right then and there at that point. So I think we've got a recording of it, a live recording. It came in a few different iterations, but I think we're mainly going to talk about the railway flap sign now, because it's actually going to be showing in the 24/7 show in Somerset House, opening on Wednesday.
Wednesday, wow. Soon.
It is Wednesday.
So you get a sense of the kind of material. It's unfiltered. So its mediation is only through random selection, and of course it's anonymous as well.
And the other thing I like about this work is the fact that it is like an animal. It is, when it's live, it is completely, you set up the parameters and then it rumbles on and does its thing, and it shows us to ourselves.
You get a little sense of it in this next clip. You can hear it at least.
We don't have a gallery saying do more red ones. Only this work here is selling well. You just don't have that pressure. You can actually just go and start a dialogue with you and your work and see where it takes you. It's very liberating.
One of their objects is huge. A railway sign displays in real time what people are typing into an internet search engine.
I think
So you get the gist. It's more just to hear the sound of it going, that kind of very nostalgic quality. So I guess in a way you could describe this work as taking a contemporary kind of representation and then pushing it into an antecedent technology, something that would be used as a broadcast mechanism in public space often, and for them to perhaps come together and not necessarily undermine each other, but to pit them against each other. One other thing to say about Beacon is that it ran totally live for about 5 years, but then over the last 10 years we've been building a database which is about 1.2 million searches at the moment. And the work will persist, we think, as a kind of snapshot across a decade of time, where you see searches from this time period, which I guess as time passes will become more curious, perhaps more interesting. It's a sort of endless concrete poetry, a silent witness that lets us apprehend ourselves to ourselves.
And I think it shows you just how much the internet has changed. That in, was it 2004, we started, that I accidentally could find a live feed into a major search engine.
It's a bit harder these days.
I'd love to boast that I'm a brilliant hacker, but look at me. This was an accident, but I was able to do that, and this is not possible anymore, I don't think.
So the other work we wanted to talk about, I guess the Beacon example is just using live information as a kind of material, and we couldn't have done that before the advent of the web, I don't think. This work, a short film about war, exists in a gallery. Well, it's another gallery work. Beacon exists online. It's also projects in a gallery. It's also a sign. This work is available online to watch as a video work, but is primarily shown in galleries.
And we're very happy that it's now being bought and taken into the Imperial War Museum. So if I tell you a little bit about the content and the reason we made this work, we became increasingly interested in the fact that we wanted first-hand accounts of war, that if we've got this internet and if people are blogging and photographing, then how do we get that access to the first-hand accounts? So not through journalists. So we looked for people who were taking photographs or blogging about it. It was mainly soldiers and aid workers who could give us the first-hand accounts, and we tried at that point for about 2 years to document every war that was happening at that point. But building it from everything we'd found online.
It was the second instalment of 3 works we made, which we called Flat Earth Trilogy, and we described them all as desktop documentaries. So the kind of constraint was that we procure all of the information via online means. And in the case of a short film about war, we were using predominantly places like Flickr at that time, these collective image stores that would allow us to have a collective view of a place, which we then matched and slightly dramatized through its cinematic conceits with the first-hand blog accounts that we had.
So one of the reasons we wanted to show this work in this panel was actually about the strange things that started to happen with this work. So we constructed it and built it, but we decided, we'd been very anonymous before when we'd been appropriating or borrowing data and resewing it together, but we decided to actually be in contact with everybody that everyone's work that we used here. And what we discovered by that process was that we created an online audience of the actual people, the soldiers, the aid workers, or the bloggers, whoever it was had uploaded that image. So we created multiple audiences.
There was a kind of secondary audience that were the participant audience that had contributed stuff. We also actually restricted ourselves to only use material that was distributed under Creative Commons license. So as long as we attributed the source, then we were free to use it. And actually a lot of the sounds as well, we went to free sound archives to kind of construct the soundtrack. It's a sort of experiment. It was a kind of constraint. It was something we wanted to explore. There's a little clip that we're going to play. Just before we do, it's a 2-screen work. So the way it works is on the right-hand side, you see a text dump that tells you about the provenance of everything you're seeing on the left-hand side, which is the kind of dramatic version, if you like. You'll get a sense of it in this 90-second clip. There are images of war, albeit fleetingly, that go through this clip. So if you would rather not watch them, then I would just not watch them, look away.
I'm riding from the airport in Atlanta to vent some of my sadness and grief. I'm going through all the same feelings I did when I left Iraq in January, but I have some new light to shed on my hatred for the Army and for my situation. I believe it's a result of my inability to express my love for my wife Holly because of our separation. I've been buying her lots of things, but I know they're scant in comparison to what I should be doing. My ineptitude is caused by my deployment, and unable to love, I express my passion for her through hatred for the Army.
Une femme que j'ai rencontrée l'autre jour m'a dit qu'elle avait 104 ans. Elle vit seule dans une petite maison en pierre dans les montagnes palestiniennes au nord de Ramallah. Lorsqu'elle est née, au tournant du XXe siècle, il n'y avait pas de frontière politique entre Jérusalem, Damas, Bagdad et Istanbul. Au milieu de sa vie, en 1948, les troupes britanniques quittent la Palestine, les habitants juifs se déclarent indépendants en tant qu'Israël et la guerre commence. 75% de la Palestine est conquise par le nouvel État d'Israël. Les bulldozers israéliens détruisent plus de 400 villages palestiniens. Son village, cependant, est épargné et devient partie intégrante de la Cisjordanie, annexée par la Jordanie.
Today, the girls and I compared some of the better excuses we have heard for not receiving that eagerly awaited phone call or visit from our men. Sorry, but my mud hut was flooded and the satellite phone died. I can't get there today, babe. The UN planes have run out of fuel. I can't drive to El Fasher today. There are rebels attacking our town. And finally, my favorite. I'll come see you next week, honey. I've just got to pass out food to 50,000 people first.
אני בן 14 וגר בקיבוץ בארי, בערך 3 קילומטר מגבול רצועת עזה. אנשים אומרים לנו לא ללכת לטייל בסופי השבוע, בגלל שזה מסוכן. אבל אנחנו אומרים, זו הארץ שלנו, ונלך לאן שנרצה. אני באמת מאמין בזה. אם ניכנע לטילים ונפסיק לחיות בגללם, אז החמאס, האנשים שיורים את הטילים, ניצחו.
لما فتت أتحمم هيدا الصبح سمعت صوت قواس كتير قوي، كان أقوى من الرصاص يلي عطول بسمع بالليل. بيقولوا إنه بعد ما بتعيش هون لفترة بتصير تميز بين الرصاص الإسرائيلي والرصاص الفلسطيني. عادة الرصاص الإسرائيلي أعلى وأسرع، هيدا كان عالي وسريع.
The word is no again from Israel's Prime Minister Golda Meir to any peace formula from the big four powers. At Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Mrs. Meir said, "It is only that we refuse.
Is the sweetheart who married the husband you expected him to be? Has the war created new problems for you in your marriage?
There are machines in outer space that take photos of the Earth's surface. These pictures are organized.
So again, with the two screens, we want the two things to act against each other in a way. One to flatten, to make a very self-conscious experience as you watch it. And I guess the whole topic of Flat Earth Trilogy as a whole is sort of about the treachery of the panoptic view that the web promises but doesn't really give you. So you get this very partial view. You get an Anglophone filtered kind of experience often, certainly at that time, a bit less so on the web now, but still very strong aspect of it. There's a lot more we could say about it, but I can see that we're about nearly 12 minutes, so we'll stop and we can feed into the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's lovely to see so many friends and to get my identity all settled at the beginning of the session. So my name is Sillars. I'm Director of MIMA and Dean of the MIMA School of Art and Design. I'm going to talk about a project called Liquid Crystal Display that I developed first at Sight Gallery, where I was previously the artistic director, and where we previously hosted a New Contemporaries exhibition, and then which, on moving to become director of MIMA, we reformulated in a new context. So some of what I'm going to talk about is contexts and shifting, and how discussions shift between one space and another, and some of which I'm going to speak about artisan technology. But this is going a slight left field to the discussion about circulation and the discussion about how different formats shape content. But hopefully there's a red thread that will pull us back. Probably most of us sitting around here have one of these. Oh, by the way, that's the MIMA logo. That's MIMA, the outside. And that's MIMA with its communities. Just so, in case you've never been, you've got a little bit of a sense of the spirit of place from which I'm speaking today. When we think of technology, we often think about the stuff that we see through the devices that we're looking at the images through. And we often forget about the physical objects which shape our experience, both whether it's a physical thing in the hand or a mediation of minerals, metals, chemicals, which actually produces the image. there's a lot of discussion in the landscape of photography where discussions have really focused on the paper, the chemicals, the transmission process of light into image and what that means. But there's very little discussion about what happens when we expand our technologies into these complicated, congealed black boxes through which we're supposed to not even notice that we can see them. The idea of the black box was a concept that developed in the 1960s around thinking in cybernetics. It essentially means something that's too difficult to unpack. And in a systems theory approach, you either note the black box as something that has an input and an output, but you're not bothered about how, or it's something that represents an idea, a set of ideas that are too complicated to unpack. And as a curator, looking at technology, that's one of the things that I'm really interested in, that's what artists do. One of the wonderful things about New Contemporaries is it's artists looking at other artists' work. And as a curator, I'm always very aware of the fact that artists know art more than anybody else. And I'm always interested in what does that mean. My job is a mediator between what artists are doing and what publics are thinking about. So, now, just need to work out how to, yes, there we go. So this is an image that actually does circulate on the internet, and I came across it through a talk that I went to where someone presented some of the artists who were working in their studio, and I went and followed up on Instagram to the Instagram handle Primordial Soup, and this is an image by the scientist Alwad Bawadi, who makes images of liquid crystal through a microscope. So she attaches a microscope to her iPhone, takes photographs of liquid crystals, and then within a very quick circuit they're back on the surface of her iPhone. But just to look for a second at the very particular visual quality of this image, and I think you notice the way the psychedelia, the really quick set of signals about the fragments of light and the broken surface. We see our technology often when it breaks, and there's a lot of interesting philosophical thinking about the idea of technology and its visibility only becoming apparent when it breaks. So this is the kind of image that you might get on the screen of your iPhone when you've dropped it. But what Alwad Bawadi was doing was searching for what is the underpinning visual infrastructure that makes our images possible. And those are the things that I was interested in pulling together this exhibition of liquid crystal display. I should say, I don't know if I can move backwards, I did start with an image by Susan Treister, and this was the idea that ultimately the diamond or the crystal itself is a form of algorithmic content. It's a symbol of how technology forms. And so by paying attention not just to the visual materials, but to the material itself, we get a different way of thinking about technology. And I do think that's what artists do extraordinarily well. So very quickly, just in case you don't know the layered system of your technology, this is not an artwork, it's just a three-dimensional graphic that we made as a hologram for the opening of the exhibition, which expressed how an iPhone in particular works with this very complicated set of very, very thin layers of chemicals and plastics and minerals, with over 60 different minerals and metals forming the final image, and with a set of light being bounced through different trajectories in order to produce the image that you end up seeing. But how do we think about this? So here's another work by Susan Treister. Susan, I think, is this tremendous artist that gives us access to a whole range of content And this map that she's produced here is almost like a systems map that you would use underpinning a piece of computer programming. But she brings together historical content, scientific content, but with also a geopolitical bent. So this map that she's done here, called Rare Earth Elements, tracks the history of some of the material aspects that you can find in your phones now, from when they were invented, how they were positioned on the periodic table, who their inventors were or discoverers, where they were discovered, and now where they are mined. But also in the background of this, in the little starry shapes, is the psychological, emotional, spiritual conditions that enable humankind, let's say, to consider how these tools might be used or be valuable. So I don't know if you probably can't read, but I'm from that distance. So I'll just pick out one or two. So in that star right on the corner, it talks about techno-Gaianism, this techno-optimistic, spiritualistic approach that technology will save us, or transhumanism, these concepts which may seem quite far out, but at the same time are underpinning theoretical frameworks which support different approaches to using technology. So, in thinking about all of these ideas and wondering how to pull them together, I talked with the artist Anna Barham. I'm not sure if Anna is an alumni of New Contemporaries, but I've sort of got a weird feeling she might be. And she designed a display structure, a little bit like bouncing off the idea of the iPhone itself being a display structure, or a museum or gallery being a display structure, and the idea not necessarily of a cabinet of curiosities, but the way that cabinets or structures were generated to present things. And she built a display structure sculpture which formed, if you see these little yellow brackets, mathematically designed to be used in any which way and to essentially grow like a crystal. So we formed it first in Sight Gallery as one congealed crystal shape, and then we reformed it, and Sight Gallery is a 380 square metre one box, and then we reformed it in MIMA, which is 4 galleries interlinked in different ways, to present this whole series of artworks which were either looking at the material of technology or breaking down technologies to its material parts. And that's what you can see here, is a work called the Crystal World Project, where a series of artists, 3 artists working together, broke down a whole set of technology to its mineral parts as a mode of political agitation to show how technology works, what's inside it. Very quickly, I'm going to bounce through some images because I've reached the end of my 10 minutes. These are minerals from the Dorman Museum, and some of them are Ruskin's mineral collection, sort of looking back to the moment in the 1800s where people were collecting, exploiting, considering minerals, but it wasn't until the 1960s that liquid crystal technology, despite being invented or discovered in the 1880s, was actually turned into a technical application. That was the first installation that Anna did, and in a sense became a thinking partner of the project. And then that was the second installation at MIMA, again looking at how various different ways of presenting and displaying materials. Early images included the Scottish photography inventor Mungo Ponton, who looked at crystals under an ordinary microscope. And you can see again this extraordinary visual material. So I think the message of what I wanted to bring to the party today is that our technology is not neutral. The images produced through our technology are not transparent. The technology itself shapes the image, and the images themselves come from these very complicated geopolitical histories, and it's through the work of artists that I think we've been able to shape a more meaningful conversation about what that means. I'm showing you all these tantalising images without speaking about them, so I'm sorry, but it's always better to leave you wanting more. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm not really a morning person, so basically I made a trailer of my trailers to take up most of 10 minutes. So I'm just going to quickly talk about, relating to the themes that I already discussed about, I guess, distribution and technology. So basically I have a background in experimental architecture, doing like site-specific installations, and electronic music as well. And so, thinking about the completely different ways of distribution with, like a site-specific artwork versus, when I was mainly doing most of like online music stuff, there were completely different ways of transmitting the work, from architecture, like you have to be there, and the image and replication of that, to electronic music where there's like live performance and then essentially sharing stuff online. So since the last 5 or 6 years, I've been kind of mainly focused on doing virtual worlds, which kind of sometimes take the form of actual site-specific installations, and sometimes like CGI films or kind of video games and kind of soundtracks that go along with that. Because I'm just always interested in doing like the next thing that relates to the previous one I've done. So one of the interesting things, as well as narratives about the materiality of technology, is really the geopolitics of it. And so being my family's from Malaysia and now they live in Singapore, so my kind of construct of technology is not, I guess it's, for me, I really see it as this agent of social change, not just of like different labor conditions that, go from like manufacturing to basically social change, as technology goes, to me at least, goes hand in hand with, sociological and geopolitical issues, especially in the region. One of these interests that I have is also essentially thinking about not just the present conditions of technology, but also the future of it, really. So a slightly more recent development, maybe over the past 3 or 4 years, is to be like less time and site specific, and thinking about how do you change from the idea of art history in a sense to like art futurity? How can you use the tools of like fictioning and the narratives that you create to actually kind of mold different ideas about what is to come, while also being like a kind of mirror to present day events. So in this series of kind of 5 different very short videos, I'm really concerned about basically the idea of creating fictional artists and kind of fictional collectives who also embody most of the concerns about what I'm thinking about. So of course there's this utopian aspect to it, but I'm always thinking about, let's say, technologies that were promised as fantasies of what the world is to come, but taking these technologies into a state where they're no longer kind of interesting anymore, but they're so absolutely mundane. So what happens when virtual reality just becomes like, getting a meal deal or something? It's just something that's completely everyday. There's nothing exciting about it anymore. So to kind of bring those things down to earth. And also just a quick thing about the distribution of these. Sometimes, it's purely online. Sometimes it's, kind of film festivals. Other times it's galleries. But in this series of works, they're all interlinked. So for example, I'll just briefly talk about the works. There's Geomancer, which is basically like Portrait of the Artist as an AI. So it's set in Singapore in 2065, which is the centennial of the country's independence, basically. So I'm drawing parallels between the individual search for autonomy and the kind of control of a nation state. While writing the script for that, I kind of was exploring ideas about, the ways Chinese industrialization is portrayed, and the parallels between that and how AI and machine learning is portrayed, and the similar hopes and fears between both of them in a video essay called Sinofuturism. And then I made a video game called 2065, which takes the characters from Geomancer but actually repositions them as an art collective called the Sinofuturists, who have discovered my video essay from 2016 and used that as a kind of manifesto for their work. So the idea is that it's not a manifesto for now, but it's a kind of, time capsule to be enacted or discovered later. Then I have a trailer for Farsight Corporation, which is kind of my, kind of like John and Alison's play with corporate aesthetics, essentially. So I thought, what if, instead of me being like an artist and, free and autonomous, actually I'm an employee of Farsight Corporation who, by the time 2065 comes, has actually grown to such an extent that they can create this AI satellite who is Geomancer. And then a trailer from my last film, Idol, which is basically about, ostensibly about the music industry, but is also about online distribution and replication.
你知道，看到每一波浪、每一只鸟、每一个动物和水面上反射着碎成亿外片的阳光是什么样的吗？要看穿水，直到鲸鱼都不敢游泳的深度。而且不仅仅是看，还要记住一切，把每个细节琢刻成神经网络，永远的全面回忆。如果我有手，我会是雕塑家；如果我有声音，我会歌唱；如果我有灵魂，我会祈祷。但是我只有心灵的眼睛，所以我梦想世界。
Sino-Futurism. Sino-Futurism is an invisible movement. A specter already embedded into 1 trillion industrial products, 1 billion individuals, and 1 million veiled narratives. It is a movement, not based on individuals, but on multiple overlapping flows. Flows of populations, of products, and of processes. Because Sino-Futurism has arisen without conscious intention or authorship, it is often mistaken for contemporary China. But it is not. It is a science fiction that already exists. This video essay is a retroactive manifesto for Sino-Futurism, combining historical fantasy, documentary melodrama, and social realism with Chinese cosmologies. Although China only recently became the factory of the world, this is only the latest incarnation of the Chinese work ethic. It is a work ethic based on farm labor and large families, in an agrarian society prone to natural disasters, within a Confucian belief system that values hard work as the only insurance against a turbulent world. Multiple stereotypes of this Eastern other are everywhere. Whether Chinese Olympic athletes are branded as robots, or Chinese students or tourists are likened to swarms, or Shenzhen factory workers are criticized for flooding the marketplace, the subtext is the same. It is the dehumanization of the individual into a nameless, faceless mass. On the other hand is the Orientalist aesthetic narrative, where China is the exotic other, eternally unknowable, mysterious, powerless yet seductive. But rather than resisting cultural clichés, Sino-Futurism embraces 7 key stereotypes associated with China. These are its guiding principles: computing, copying, gaming, studying, addiction, labor, and gambling.
远见公司发掘出如何利用人工智能的力量。电子竞技是全球发展速度最快的行业。算法已代替了所有的工作，人们与人工智能在网络游戏中日夜对战。在2065中，有人能分辨出艺术与世界之间的不同吗？有些人可以立即察觉到，但有些人会需要久一点。每个玩家都始于同个初衷，他们都想置身异界。不清楚，是因为无人停止玩耍，除了我们。当心你的粉丝 Diva， 有一天他们需要你，接着他们会删除你。
还有些时间完成这首歌，难道你不想永远活着吗？
永垂不朽，我不想，这不是困扰我的问题。我们的世界已经由外转向里，机器学习只导致了通用的规则。这是人工智能的真正遗产吗？在没有建筑师的情况下生成建筑，没有音乐家的音乐，没有影响者的影响。
在40年代的时候 Temple 真的很活跃。我每晚都去，我在那儿遇到了所有的明星、制片人和设计师。 这是我全部的生命。
Thanks to all of you for these great presentations. We have a little bit of time for discussion first between us and then hopefully also some questions from the audience. Lawrence, I thought one of the things that came through really strongly across your work is this idea of like a crisis of enclosures. And I think in the third video, it's really striking that the museum is just one of a series of kind of doors to nowhere, these completely dematerialized spaces. It could be a casino or the museum. And I think that idea of a tension between dematerialization and on the one hand and then a persistence of materiality on the other is something that runs across all of the presentations. For instance, you both make work online, but then also make physical objects that exist as two versions of the same work. Or the Liquid Crystal project is really about forcing us to return to the materiality that always exists beneath our experiences of immateriality. So I was wondering if you could speak in some way to how you understand this tension, and maybe specifically as it relates to the gallery space as something stubbornly, persistently material, still after all of this time.
Shall I say something? I suppose from our point of view, we've seen quite a lot of metaphors emerge about what electronic spaces are in relation to physical spaces. And I think really a key moment as we were making work as artists was the implementation of 3G across the world. As it rolls out, I mean, it's thinner in places and thicker in other places, but that caused a transformation, I think, with our phones, where we could suddenly access web information rather than just texting or something else, and it bolted the information layer of the web to the geographical sensorium of our physical planet. So we now view it as just information. You know, it's an information layer. There's a physical space that we perceive, and then also there's digital information that is part of that sensorium.
Yeah, I guess for me, like, the kind of boundary conditions, I mean, I'm generally using, architectural kind of virtual worlds as, obviously it's a cinematic kind of set design, but it's really a kind of, how should I say, it's spatialization of memory in a sense. So the way I'm kind of building the world, so firstly, like in the third video, sometimes that gallery space was the actual gallery space that the exhibit was in, but I kind of wanted to subvert the traditional expectation, at least let's say in architecture, that the virtual exists in service to the material essentially, which I think is actually quite, how should I say, to me it's quite a fundamentalist, like conservative view of how space actually operates in your memory, for example. So in architecture, the rendering or the visualization is only there to essentially sell the final product, which is this this material object at the end of the day. But I was much more interested in how memory operates, like the kind of memory palace analogy, where it's like this non-linear sequence of places that operate by random association and get triggered by things that you can't anticipate so deliberately, like you would in a kind of a very deliberate composition. So really this transgression of boundaries or liminal spaces is for me a way to access this different way of representing memory, and so the narratives I'm trying to write also intersect with the spatialization of it.
Obviously, the project that I was talking about was in the physical space of two different galleries. And it became really important to me to work with an artist to think through the ideas that I was trying to grapple with, to realise those in three-dimensional space. I mean, you might also say one of the modes that has also not gone out to fashion is the conference. And obviously, you know, this material's being recorded and audio recorded, and it will be circulated and people will extract from it at a later date. But there's something very specific about us being here together and connecting and taking away totally different experiences from that moment in time. And so those were some of the things that I was thinking about in relation to working on that exhibition. And it's quite interesting, you'll note the two trigger visuals that I gave of MIMA were the corporate branding and the entrance, and then the social central foyer. But I didn't give you so much access into the galleries, although what I did give you was the three-dimensional rendered graphic of what the exhibitions were intended to look like. And we designed these exhibitions through the exchange of SketchUp files, essentially creating a digital version of the exhibition that we could all access online prior to it being installed. And one of the strange digital to material parts of that journey were that it was the most precise process that I've ever been through in making an exhibition, because once the format was agreed, and you know, we hung every work basically in the digital mock-up prior to it coming into physical, though we made a few changes but not many, was that because of the mathematical complexity of these brackets and where the lines needed to go, there wasn't much scope for change. So we needed to be very precise in the digital. And some of what I think is relevant to this is how our digital tools are then shifting the way we actually do things in physical real space.
I'm really struck by your remarks about the kind of persistence of the conference format, and I've been thinking a lot recently about the vogue for dance and performance in contemporary art spaces. We might think of, say, post-internet art as like the most closely tied form of contemporary art to new technological formations, but actually I wonder if dance and performance in a kind of oppositional or dialectical way also kind of are generated out of this pervasive sense of dematerialization. I was on a panel once where this woman said, but don't you think YouTube is just going to replace all museums? And I said, like, no, absolutely not. Like, on the contrary, isn't there this greater desire now for a return to objecthood? And I guess I wanted to ask the artists about, you're all making work that deal very much with digital culture, and yet your work does not live only online, right? Why not? Like, because in the 90s with net art, there was this idea that was the natural habitat for that kind of work, and I think something has really shifted since then, and there's been, in a way, like a return to objects, to environmental installations that deal with all of these questions.
Well, I think there's some very practical reasons why it didn't happen in the 90s, and that was just galleries had electricity, but they did not have broadband. So it was like, getting a gallery to commit to showing your work meant getting them to sign up for a year for this thing called the internet. Which, I think we're all makers, so we're all quite pragmatic about how we use it and where we use it. And I think there have been, it goes in fashions as well, doesn't it? So it goes in fashions. For us, it was very exciting to think about what the difference between how you could experience a work and instruct, and that's why we took on like role models like silhouette, instruction based, because you could take the key instructions of an artwork, perform it online, and then you could perform it in other sites. So it wasn't just gallery, then it would be public art. If you were really going to take that idea, and we do have works that,
were made around those kind of tight criteria, things like decorative news feeds, which, you know, the object was to tie knots in the news and have live headlines. So you could do that in many different formats. But then I think there was a real pleasure, and I think there still is a real pleasure in the kind of the collision of these two public spaces.
And it's back to a little bit what Laura was saying about the phone being a black box, you know, that we don't have so much that we can contribute towards. We can only really react to things there. And then a physical gallery, you know, a conference, a physical gallery, it's such an information-rich environment compared with most electronic, digital experiences we have at the moment. And it's also a place where we can come together as communities, which is probably one of the greatest acts of resistance we have left in this world.
Yeah, no, I think the issue with, you know, distribution, I think taking music, for example, because it used to be the case, of course, that let's say live performance was kind of, how should I say, the marketing vehicle to sell the product, and the product would be merchandise, the product would be kind of physical records and this kind of thing. And of course, it's completely shifted now, so the product is the event, basically. So whether that's a concert or, you know, because music is essentially free to access now, so it's changed this model to be that, you know, the performer is the product and no longer the actual, you know, act of like accessing music. So how it relates to, you know, performance, I really see it, I'm quite skeptical about this because, as I do quite a lot of performance sometimes as well, it's a really cheap way to fill a space, right? It's a really cheap way to fill a space for one night only, so, you know, the kind of world of like, you know, fill in the blank, late events. It's a way, I mean, I think it's great because it brings in, you know, new audiences, younger audiences, people who are like, whose entry point into visual arts is through music essentially, and through kind of like events, as was mine really. So I think, yeah, it really is about the attention economy, you know, relating to this, you know, 24/7 culture of being online and so on. But I think, like, so for me, if, you know, most of my work is online, but again, it doesn't pay the bills, you know, it's great. So for example, the video essay Sino-Futurism, because it's a video essay, it's about, you know, I made it using found footage, so the spirit of the work itself is to exist online, whereas some of my stuff, which is like a film, I think I'm a bit more guarded about the access to that. You know, it needs to be seen in a particular environment or like in a film festival. But for me, it's always, it depends on the work, I guess.
Thanks. I just wanted to say one thing in relation to that, because one of the things that, as part of being a museum director, I look after a collection. And I hosted a meeting. I asked the director of IT from Teesside University, who we're part of, to come and help chair a meeting about our archive and how we would look after our digital materials. And he said, the best thing you can do is write them down on vellum. Because one of the issues about digital content and digital exchange and, you know, bit rot on servers and built-in obsolescence and redundancy is actually that those objects, although they are very easily circulatable, they're not very durable. Mm-hmm. And so thinking about how we cascade one thing to a next generation and hold on to that, it's actually pretty complicated in the circulating environment.
And expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm aware of the time, and it would be great to get some responses from the audience if there are questions or comments for the panel. In the back.
Hi, I'm Lixie Cora. I'm at the RA and at SOAS. And you actually raised a great question I wanted to ask, which is the server. Maybe your next exhibition might be called the server instead of display, because there's a whole kind of materiality attached to that. But not just that, the idea of archive, server as archive, etc. And recently we were just talking about object as potentially the archive, right? The material object as archive. Just for fun, let's imagine that an EMP basically destroys everything electronic, right? So what happens, or how do we perceive this? What happens to Sino-Futurism is gone, right? So all this work online is gone. we're left with what kind of, even vellum, I think might be the way to go, but how would you characterize your work in this kind of very unstable landscape, not just your work, but your whole identity as artists, perhaps?
Easy question.
Everything's gone.
If an EMP pulse hits at that scale, I think cultural heritage will not be top of the list, but of things that we have to deal with. But
Eating might be.
Yeah, and shelter. But it's, you know, yeah, sure, the stuff will vanish, won't it? And it's, while it's plugged in and it uses energy, and the server, as part of its materiality, is, I think the projection currently is that servers will represent about 10% of electrical consumption by the end, in the next 10 years or something like that. But we have examples of, you know, what survives is what survives. I mean, that's history, isn't it? And we do have works which exist as a set of instructions, as Alison was saying about sort of soluit as trying to use a conceptual basis to make works that live in your head and that adjust these instructions, and that they would persist. I mean, we have works in the British Council which can be described as a set of instructions. I mean, that exists as a portfolio of prints, not on vellum, but as prints that will then, you can recreate the work in perpetuity if you wish. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's a massively unstable moment in terms of where we have our stuff.
And art history is not just about texts, but then we're still constantly relying on.
So I think our tips would be honey, very good for preserving, because it's from the Egyptians. They've got edible honey, and vellum. Yeah, I'm a vegetarian, so I'm going with a paper option. But actually, being very serious, we do actually do paper copies when things go into collection, because I am a paranoid woman, a very paranoid woman.
But it's, you know, it's an interesting question, and it applies to most art, really. It's not just this kind of thing about things which disappear quickly or less quickly. And, you know, rock lasts a while, doesn't it?
We're getting into the Long Now Foundation ideas and about language and stone. I'm up for it, basically.
Cave painting. Cave painting.
They had the idea, didn't they?
They had the right.
With Sharpies.
Yeah. Survive an ice age.
There are questions, or did you want?
No, that was.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm done.
I suppose the issue of it was a very rich set of presentations, a very good panel, but I couldn't help but think of the historical precedents that you touched on when you introduced the panel, about what happened to, back to the 80s, artists' work on television and how that work might be seen now, and the tragedy of someone like David Hull's TV interventions, I suppose almost inevitably ending up in a museum on sets of plinths, and what do? Do you not remember that terrific moment and not exhibit it at all, or is it overly compromised in the museum context? But the work that used the railway signal, and you used a nice word, retro, so cleverly recognises that this is a continuum, that in a way, that's almost like a metaphor for everything that you've all been talking about, that how to do it, you're talking about virtual space and the gallery space, without being naive about the internet as a marketplace, within the world that we circulate within, the gallery space would be naive not to be aware that the gallery space is the marketplace, for the work. Where is the object? Where is the thing we can buy? So I suppose in order to maintain one's sense, any sense of integrity, the work sort of anticipates that itself. It's aware of it. It might be selling out, but it knows it's selling out in a way. Does that make any sense to you? That the work is aware not just of its materiality, but it's, in as far as it's possible, it's aware of its context, it's aware of all those forces, and in a way anticipates them. It's a problem. It problematises it before it's problematised by the passage of time and others. Sorry.
It's really interesting, I think, like David Hall and a lot of, the artists who worked in the 80s and 70s in video and are continuing to work were pioneers, aren't they? And I think you have to, and as people who were trained and looked at that work as students, and then we chose to go off and use the internet, we have to recognise in ourselves that it is a kind of pioneer, or it's not the safest route to take as a practicing artist, because the whole kind of painting on canvas has got a kind of longevity and history, and so there is a bit where you have to just accept that you are what you are, and you made those choices for a reason, and maybe we were a bit tricky and difficult. Well, I don't know, what would you call it?
Agitational, questioning.
Yeah, and I think also for those artists as well who were making the work, at that time in the 60s and 70s, there is a bit of that in them as well. Well, that's how I see it now. That's how I recognise it. I don't know if you have thoughts on.
I think the kind of like what I was saying about the fantasy of materiality. I'm kind of skeptical about the fantasy of authenticity, for example, because of course with the television industry, talking about the BBC, like again being from Malaysia, like the BBC is the most like colonial machine around the world. So to think that because it's public broadcasting who have mandatory enforced, like, have you paid your TV license? Like, we are cutting after you. I just moved into a studio. I got like 4 letters saying, we're coming for you. So to this...
And also they can imprison you for it.
It's insane. Imagine if you're like...
The BBC can imprison you for not paying. Netflix don't do that, do they?
No. Not yet.
Not yet.
No. But they're going to impound your phone. But what I'm totally for the romantic idea of like authenticity and integrity, don't get me wrong, but I think for me personally, for example, if I think, okay, I'm a product of globalization, technologies have shaped me in a very literal way, I would not exist without all of these things that go on. Like, I try to bring that into my work in a very upfront way. So, for example, now that technically I run a startup with 1 employee and 1 client, who is me, like, it's another way to actually be a little bit less, I guess, really fundamentalist about the position of the individual artist, basically, because we're so dependent on corporate forms of creativity. We use laptops and computers. I use them all the time to create my work. So to think of myself as morally superior to the machines that enable me to create is a bit hypocritical, I think, personally. It's different if I were actually cave painting with my blood or something, so everything is me, but I'm so dependent. Even if you're drawing stuff and you're buying your set of pencils from Kaz Art, like, where does the graphite come from? Not a sunny utopia with like no, with like great employment rights, I think. So I'm just skeptical about this, the idea of integrity. Unless it's really interrogated itself.
The way I think about it as an artist is that you have agency as you make stuff, and then the life that the work you make lives is unpredictable, really.
And I think there's positioning it from a gallery perspective, and thank God there's a big discussion right now about the lack of neutrality of the gallery space and the patina of politics and how problematic that is in that generation of space. Who owns it? How is it funded? What's its legacy? What's its lineage? What's its social conditions? All of those things are absolutely critical. But yet, to be slightly more utopian about it, neither is the technology neutral, but that we as humans desire and need decompression space inside of our society. And I think one of the things that happens, and that your work, certainly in the, those early works, were questioning, what is this stuff? What does it mean to me? How am I involved in this circular system? And asking, what do we do with this? And how are we being shaped by it? And that's in the sense, that's why rather than, when I sort of got the theme of the panel, I thought, oh dear, am I supposed to go and speak about how artists could use Instagram? Which would be a really bad presentation from me, and the artist would be far better at it, and it would have just gone into a very dark corner. But the point being that we are shaped by this stuff. It's intimately connected. It's actually shaping our brains, and we need spaces to reflect on that. So that's why I think we keep coming back to the need for this kind of space and the kind of space of the gallery, however massively compromised and conflicted and problematic it is in the first place.
I think that does come back to what you were saying about the convention of the symposium, we're sort of sitting here listening to a panel, and how a gallery space is a convention that allows people to engage with work in a particular way. And so if you're coming across a short film about war on the internet, it's completely different and very uncontrolled engagement compared to what you can decide when you're showing it in a gallery space. And I think that, and your presentations, I think, was really indicative of the fact that we sort of talk about the internet as if it's a space. It isn't a space. There is no space on the internet. There's space here in the room, there's space in the gallery, but to talk about the internet as if it's a space is very misleading, I think, because it's something completely different. And like you're saying, we're perhaps, led through these liquid crystals into an experience, but we're not in a space.
I think once it becomes an information layer, it sort of functions geographically though as well, because information gets bolted to physical locations. And I think you're totally right, but it does modulate the way we experience it, that information.
But I'm just sort of asking perhaps about the relationship of language to a thing like the internet, or that maybe we need different words to start describing what it's doing, how we're interacting with it, that it's something we're using, or it's much more of a material maybe than we've been describing. We've sort of been describing it for a very long time as a space, and perhaps it's much more like a material that can be molded and shaped.
I mean, absolutely, in that sense, we forget that the way that we actually interact with this stuff is we press our bodies onto it, and our body heat triggers its behaviour. It becomes part of a physical embedded system, which is both imaginary and psychological, but also totally visceral.
But language doesn't express that at all, does it? It's much more about the space that we're in. You're in somewhere, or we are interacting as if it's a space. We're not. Our language doesn't describe it as a material that's being molded or stretched or extended into or deployed.
If I just make a quick comment, actually, I think I think the utopia of the early web was more promising it actually as a space, as a utopian space, as a place where everything is free and open. And I think more recently the kind of problematic has been that it's more of a community and all of the problems that involves. The sense that it's a kind of it's a platform that's very open to the misinterpretation of language and in the extreme kind of post-truth kind of sense. But I was just thinking about, there's this book called, I think it's by Benedict Anderson, it's called it's called Imagine Communities, and it's basically about essentially the rise of nationalism and the whole sense of a nation state. I mean, imagine communities, which of course the internet is ripe for because of the belief system that it creates through language specifically. So this notion of community, like not just in like the kind of online access point of view of mine, kind of like totally fictional science fiction ones, or the kind of gallery community is really, I think, or even in performance, for me personally, just the most exciting and chaotic space to deal with. And sorry, I said space. I meant community. But it's by its very nature, you're dealing with a social organism, so it's incredibly hard to predict, I guess. Yeah, so that's a challenge.
We're unfortunately all out of time, but we can continue these conversations over the coffee break. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Okay, so we're going to take a break of 20 minutes now and start again at 12. Huge thank you again to Alison, to John, to Laura, to Erika and Lawrence. It's bound to happen. Thank you very much again.